Chapter 1 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. Chapter 1. Now and then people have got in my way and bullets have been used. But it is another thing to kill a man in what is called cold blood. Every one of us has perhaps wondered that God has let certain people live, and each of us has probably wished for the daring to do what God should, in our opinion. He knows all about everybody, and that perhaps makes the difference, since circumstantial evidence has no influence on him. That perhaps explains why he lets some people live on, though perhaps not why others die. There came a time when I held the lives of two men in my hands and did not know which to throw away. One had killed a woman, and the other had believed evil things of her. For a time I felt that the latter was even the more deserving of death, and I was sure that both had lived too long. Yet I hesitated to wink at the death of either. Contrary to the opinion that many people have of me, I am scrupulous about certain things. "Don Everhard," a wrathful, youthful cousin of mine once had said in a tone of disappointment and disgust, "you talk like a preacher." He had encountered certain scruples of mine and had angrily searched for the most crushing thing he could say to a professional gambler who was usually spoken of in the newspapers as a gunfighter and occasionally faintly damned by the police, who were as frequently wrong for a clever crook. This is essentially a complicated story because from first to last it covers many years and involves the motives and wickedness of more than one man. Sheer luck, if not accident, twice brought me into the plot, though I sometimes suspect fate of being too thoughtful a dramatist to leave anything to mere chance. In a way, what I have to tell comes about because Jack Richmond, that same cousin, got himself engaged to Cora Cornwall. When I learned that her name was Cornwall and that she came from Utah, I had reason to meditate interestedly. In my youth, our family, a rather large one, had been land poor in Southern California, but Jack came of age and into possession of an oil field all his own. He arrived with his pockets full of money to camp on my doorstep. His imagination had been fired by what he had heard of me, in spite of the censorship which heads of our family had maintained. I was the disgrace, and he had ambitions to follow in my tracks. But, as I have said, he fell in love. Ordinarily, I do not interfere with the folly of other people, not even of my own cousins, but I had dragged him almost by the ears from a card table, and he was indignant. So he classed me with a preacher, which was not without its complimentary angle. I really could not blame him for gambling, since we had the same grandfather back of us, and there was a strong undertow in our blood to do the things for which he had been famous. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. Jack, who was not a gay spendthrift and did not like the flashing luxury that usually attends the giddy young man of money, usually dined with me in a quiet restaurant that gave more attention to its cuisine than to potted plants and gilded frescoing. One evening he chanced to dine there alone, and a girl at a nearby table helplessly appealed to him. She had lost her purse, and her check came to $1.70. He did what anybody would have done, and what she intended a young fool would do also. Her explanations were plausible, and her personality seemed fascinating. He went home with her and was introduced to two old men, an uncle and a father, who, against Jack's protests, refunded the $1.70 and gave him their thanks. With the usual impudence, he said of them to me, "The old fellow with the glasses and the twisted nose is the father. The other dyspeptics are uncle." When he told me that their names were Joseph and Daniel Cornwall, I said nothing, though I had much to say. I knew it was not by chance that he had been more or less artfully brought into their house. For a month, in one way or another, those same Cornwall brothers had been trying to get in touch with me. I did know nothing about the one called Joseph, and not all that I wished to know about the one called Daniel. Not all I would have liked to know in case our affairs were to be further entwined. They had been entwined, if I may use so mild a word, some years before, but he didn't know it. That is, he did not know that Don Richmond, alias Everhard, was the same person that had entered his office, plundered his safe, and later disposed very effectively of the person who tried to recover the little box of papers. Daniel Cornwall's suspicions centered on a man named Smithers, who was far from being innocent. But I must continue with Jack's part for a few words more. He called on Cora again. He liked her. He loved her. I have often wondered why. There must be a benevolent destiny that occasionally takes young fools in hand. But Jack seemed to win the confidence of the two loose-jointed, secretive old men by the very remark that anyone would have thought most likely to get him thrown out of the house and have the door bolted behind him. He was blindly led to discuss what relatives he had in the city, and, with a little burst of pride, mentioned that I, Don Everhard, was his cousin. At that, he said, they became surprised and eager. My name is well known. Any time a hack writer, one of these fellows that fill what space is left over from the day's news and are paid by the inch, simply must pay his rent, he rehashes what somebody before him has written of my record, discusses my psychology, and speculates on how a man with so many notches on his gun — I never notched a gun in my life — can move unmolested in a civilized community. Those old fellows began to ask interested questions. They wanted to meet me. Jack said that he would have me over the very next afternoon. He did. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Jack had explained to me.
Ugly old codgers. Bet they're rich. Father's Joseph and Uncle's Dan. How do I know? She called one Uncle Dan and he called the other Joseph. Think I was asleep? Not me. I was sitting on the edge of my chair swatting every question that came over the plate.
We were met at the door by a servant who did not succeed in hiding the fact that he was surprised to see me. He had no way of knowing from my face or manner that I noticed his surprise, but I did. As there is not one face in 1,000 that I cannot place immediately, I was a little puzzled to find myself unable to remember one who showed such marked recognition of me. He was a man somewhat above middle-aged, slightly bald, rather red of face and well-fed. He looked like a hypocrite, as every able-bodied man does when he plays flunky, bowing in those whom he really does not think are his betters or even his equals. Perhaps they wouldn't be if he did not choose the lapdog's way of keeping his stomach full. This fellow's jaw stiffened and his eyes popped. His hands were pretty unsteady, and I saw drops of sweat on his forehead. We went through the hall into an old room with a high ceiling. The room appeared musty and full of shadows, though the curtains were up and the autumnal sun was bright. We were greeted by the two old men. I say they were old, though at a glance I saw they were aged by something besides years. Mr. Daniel Cornwall I had met before, but then I had worn a mask. He was the elder, the larger, the more decisive, and I did not doubt at all but that he was the most criminal, though excepting that his face was flabby rather than thin, both men looked somewhat alike. Mr. Joseph Cornwall appeared almost consumptive. I heard him cough frequently. His face was thin, just skin across bones, his nose prominent and a little twisted. He had a thin mustache that, like a ragged veil, fell over his loose mouth, and the large-rimmed glasses accentuated the queerness of his face. His voice was harshly husky. I had not known him except remotely. He had in some way remained entirely outside of my circle of experience during the time I was in Utah. Daniel Cornwall was the dominant character. Their intentions were something more than friendly. I could not imagine what kind of starling Jack had found in that nest of lean owls. Cora did not come into the room until we had been there for some time. I could not guess what those old fellows actually wanted, but I had known all along that they were after something protective from me. I am continually having people after me for one reason or another, and not alone from those who think that my gun is for sale. It would not be easy to count the number of people who dislike me and, as the saying goes, have it in for me. I have enemies that I have never seen, never heard of, since some people hold a grudge against me because their own friends have been hurt, some of them buried. After a few words, Joseph mentioned that they too were from the West, as if that put a tribal relation upon us. They sat back with their eyes on me, and Jack imperviously rattled on. He said nothing worth repeating, and they were obviously waiting, for what I did not know, but for something probably that would give them opportunity to talk to me alone. Being a fine pair of old schemers, they had already prepared for that. I had noticed the man, the footman who met us at the door, trying to attract Daniel Cornwall's attention when we came into the room, but he had been ignored. Presently he returned and with an obvious effort kept his eyes from me while telling the old fellow Daniel that he would like to speak to him on a matter of great importance, sir. Daniel looked at him as one might order away a well-trained dog, made a gesture, and said, "I'm quite busy, Quiller. I'm busy." "It might be important," said Joseph a little nervously to his brother as Quiller reluctantly turned away, shooting a glance at me. "His nerves are going," Daniel growled. "This morning he was all excited over something he dreamed." "But Dan," the other began, and it was plain that his nerves were also jangled. "Being frightened at every shadow isn't going to help matters," said the more aggressive Daniel, a very hard expression coming into his face for a second. He spoke rather testily. I knew that Daniel had a temper, a great amount of resolution, much cunning and no honor. I knew also, one who plays poker for a living knows many things by simply looking into a man's face, that Joseph was much like him. Finally, Cora came in dressed in a plain, neat, tailored suit of dark cloth. She was not at all I had expected. Not at all. I looked at her very hard. She was of the same type, appearance, and manner as a woman whom some 10 years before I had gone out of my way to help. It was strange indeed, but I rather liked her at once, though I knew she had made a dupe of my cousin. For one thing, she wasn't pretty, and having that blessing, of course, did not think that every man was made to sigh for her, to flirt with her, to hover about her, and be satisfied with smiles and artificial blushes. It is a great day in the lives of blonde flappers when they learn how to blush by holding their breath. Cora was a blonde, but she did not blush. Her eyes were gray and serious. She had probably been matter-of-fact and serious in the restaurant and actually fascinated Jack, where a more pretty and giddy young person would have aroused him to only a flirtation. She was intelligent and direct. I have given my nights and much of my days to leaning across green-topped tables looking into the eyes of men. One plays most games at cards by watching the pips. One plays poker by watching faces. For a long time I watched her face with a hard scrutiny that must have made her uneasy. I did not care. I wondered if slight, blonde, gray-eyed women were all alike. She had her hat in her hand as if she were going out. After being introduced to me, she said, "Uncle Dan, something seems wrong with Quiller. He looks ill." "Quiller's been drinking again," Daniel Cornwall said gruffly. Then more personally, "You're going out, my dear?" She looked at him with a touch of surprise. She was no adept at deception. It was her role to go out and take Jack with her. In a few minutes she did, and I was left alone with the two old men. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording's in the public domain. Chapter 4. It would be needless, if not tedious, to tell at length all that was said. The young people had no sooner left the room than Daniel got up and drew together the sliding doors across the entrance from the hallway. Joseph, with an attempt at a confidential smile, moved his chair a little closer toward me. Daniel looked about cautiously and, seeming satisfied, also pulled his chair a little nearer to me. "Mr. Everhard," Daniel began, rubbing his hands together, "chance has at last brought us together." He said it with a grin smugly. His grin was unpleasant, his smugness repugnant. For a brief moment I wondered if he knew more than I gave him credit for knowing, and if he thought that he had trapped me. But he was merely trying to make me think accident had taken place of design. "And, Mr. Everhard," he went on, "as we have conveyed to you before, we are rich men." Joseph nodded and smiled encouragingly. I did not say anything. I looked at them from one to the other. My thoughts were scooting in and out. I knew that Daniel Cornwall had enemies. Some of them, one at least, a very powerful man who thought himself more or less helpless so long as Daniel retained possession of a little black steel box, or rather of its contents. I knew, too, that he had another enemy, said to be a wild, dangerous fellow who would have, had he known who I was, possibly have tried to make good certain and jealous threats. "And we will be generous," Daniel added impressively, as if I did not know that he had a reputation for being miserly. The point to the 15 minutes of fumbling speech was this. They had previously tried to engage me as a sort of personal guard, and they now asked me to state what terms I pleased. They were old, innocent men, and in danger. Would I interest myself in their behalf? In looking about anxiously for someone to help them, they had thought no one else could do so well as I. They had written letters asking me to call on them. Those being coldly answered, they had sent a lawyer to engage my interest. They might have sent the devil with results. I dislike lawyers. All of them. I mentioned the protective value of the police. Daniel made a deprecating gesture and grinned. The the police were all right for watching rat holes. They could follow tracks. This was different. I mentioned private agencies. He came back flatteringly and said their need was for a man of high personal courage and resource. Steve Ellis, he said, could evade the police. Private detectives would not be likely to stand against him. Daniel Cornwall himself was a crafty, vicious, enormously rich old rascal, the sort of a man whom it was said that he never kept an inconvenient promise nor rewarded a friend. I knew something of Steve Ellis. I had known his wife very well. I also knew something of the man who was then governor of Utah and Cornwall's most powerful enemy. Perhaps that was one, or maybe the reason why Daniel Cornwall was out of the state, though in his little black box he had put evidence that could ruin and wreck the man. It was a curious and complicated situation. The governor, whom I will call Walsh, though that in no way resembles his name, had in his younger days become involved, perhaps more or less innocently, in some profitable crooked work. Cornwall had stored the indubitable legal evidence of that in his little black box. Walsh knew much that was crooked, wicked, even dastardly of Cornwall, and longed to bring him to justice, to crush him, wipe him out. But to do so, he would have to sacrifice his own career, for Cornwall would have retaliated by opening the little black box. Cornwall, for his part, would have liked to exterminate Walsh, but if he attacked Walsh, then the governor would probably, in the midst of his own ruin, land Cornwall in prison, if not onto the scaffold. Supposing that a multimillionaire can ever be hanged, which is doubtful in a country that leaves justice in the hands of lawyers. So it was that they were like two powerful giants, deadly in their enmity, but aware that it would be mutually ruinous if they made an open fight. Let Walsh once get his hands on that black box, and Cornwall was doomed. Nor did I doubt at all that Cornwall hesitated at thoughts of assassination and trying to figure out how he could dispose of Walsh. The immediate concern of the Cornwalls, however, was not with Walsh, it was with Steve Ellis. The situation was made more peculiar and complicated by Ellis. Whereas Cornwall and Walsh were continually bluffing each other, and neither wanted or dared to come actually to a crisis, Ellis was thought to be implacable in his hatred of Daniel Cornwall. The Cornwalls thought, as many people have, that I was sort of a cutthroat, for sale to a high bidder and with cunning enough to evade punishment. I have evaded punishment, largely because I never deserved it. Even the police, east and west, certainly no friends of mine, were not without a kind of, a kind of gratitude for the way I had come out of corners into which I had occasionally been crowded. Law-abiding citizens, whom the police feel it their duty to protect and to avenge, do not shoot at people from the rear or from shadows, do not pick quarrels and lay traps. Moreover, I never bothered the police with complaints. The police and courts everywhere more or less respect the ruling of Western juries to the effect that the man who draws last and shoots first is innocent. So those two old fellows, wholly unaware that I knew a great deal about the cause of their fears, with a kind of grotesque eagerness in which both became excited, tried to tell me the history of their haunting terrors. It was a long story, and Daniel lied a great deal. I won't repeat their story, for it was largely false, and when I have said that Daniel claimed Steve Ellis's hate was inspired over certain mining claims, I have told enough. That part may or may not have been true. I did not know. Anyway, perhaps money had originally been at the bottom of the trouble, but Ellis seems to have been the sort of man who looked for trouble. He had, so I heard, repeatedly said that he would kill me. He did not know my name. He knew merely the name I happened to be using at the time, and then he was in a position to make threats with impunity, for he was in the penitentiary. He believed, or pretended to believe, that my presence under the roof of his wife's house was injurious to his honor, and since he was in prison, he was dependent on the tales that other men carried to him. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. It chanced that some years before I had been in Utah, in various parts of Utah, and had not taken the trouble to introduce myself to anybody. That is, by the name which was perhaps known to some of the people there even then. I was patiently waiting until the police of San Francisco had, as they eventually did do, assured themselves that I had had nothing to do with a certain little affair in which numerous liars conspired together to get me out of the way legally. There had been enough perjured witnesses to hang a saint. I may mention, though it has nothing to do with the story, that, at last impatient, I returned quietly to San Francisco, made a midnight call upon the ringleader of the frame-up, and impressed on him that I was weary of waiting for his conscience to get the better of his prejudice against me. I suggested that he confess the next morning. He did. So it was that during the time I had been in Utah under the name of Smith or some such non-entity, I had minded my own business and got into trouble. It came about through a woman, Mrs. Ellis. Her husband was in prison, and for some reason or other she wanted him out. I was staying quietly in her home, paying board and rent. I liked her because she asked no questions. She was a little, blonde, gray-eyed woman and told me some things about herself, not with the idea of arousing sympathy, but because it is the nature of her sex to talk. Among other things, she loved this husband, Steve Ellis, who was in prison. She said that he was innocent. Most wives do say that sort of thing about their convicted husbands. She said that the trouble had originated over a copper mine claim, and that Daniel Cornwall, one of many copper kings of the West, had railroaded Steve Ellis because he wouldn't do some of the Cornwall dirty work. I asked questions in one direction and another, and as I loafed a good deal over poker tables, I had plenty of chance to hear all manner of reports. As nearly as I could tell, Daniel Cornwall was a scoundrel, and Steve Ellis was a dangerous man with numerous friends. I heard that Ellis had formerly been a gunman in Cornwall's employ. I heard many things, and some of them were no doubt true. Mrs. Ellis maintained, however, that he was innocent. She said that Steve had told her that if she, or any of his friends, could get a hold of a little black box in Cornwall's private safe, Cornwall himself would pull wires and bribe officials to get him out. Mrs. Ellis said that Steve was a good man in his way, but it seemed that he was always in trouble through no fault of his own.
"Why," she said, "his own child scarcely knows him."
The child was in a boarding school where Mrs. Ellis, by dint of scrimping and gathering money from Lord knows where, kept her under the illusion that a girl's life would be easier and happier if secluded and educated. I had had nothing in particular to do, and having assured myself that Daniel Cornwall was a mean, rich old devil, and looking the ground over carefully, I took certain precautions by way of disguise and paid him a visit. As nearly as he could tell, I looked like a rough miner, the ends of a mustache poked from beyond my mask. My clothes were of the sort a miner would be likely to wear when he thought he was passing for a city fellow. It was necessary, of course, to dispose of a servant or two before I reached him. I made the visit late in the evening, and I tied the servants comfortably in a corner and left them there to meditate. Daniel Cornwall was a bachelor, so his establishment was easily raided. I found him in bed. I got him out and made him open the safe. Not finding what I wanted, I induced him to put on his clothes and go with me to his office. I succeeded in convincing him that he would be shot if he tried to give an alarm, and also that something of the kind would happen if he looked around at me during the time I had the mask off. For obviously I could not go parading through even nearly deserted streets at 11 p.m. with a mask on. I have found that rich men are easily bluffed by threats of violence. Anyway, we went to his office and he opened the safe there. He nearly dropped when he saw me remove the little black steel box. He offered money. He offered almost everything imaginable. I took the key away from him and opened the box. I read enough of the papers to see what they were about. Walsh at that time was Attorney General or something of the kind. In a kind of disgust, I threw the key toward an open window. It went out. I replaced the papers and slammed the lid down, not noticing that a corner of one of the papers had stuck out. "I'll never get that box open," he cried. "It's a special lock." "You won't need to open it for some time," I told him. "This is what I came after, but there is a good chance that you may get it back." He had thought that I was looking into the box in the hope of finding money or jewels, and he was tremendously wrought up when he saw that I intended to carry it off. I let him bite into a handkerchief stuffed into his mouth and tied his arms and legs to a chair. Then I went out and into a cheap rooming house where I had changed clothes earlier in the evening. It was one of those houses that did not have running water, but a pitcher and large bowl for washing purposes was in the room. I put the bowl near the window so as to carry out the odor of smoke and burned a few little things I wanted to get rid of, my mustache among them. The next day a messenger delivered a package to Mrs. Ellis. It came from one of Steve's friends, so a scrap of paper with it said. She was a wise woman and did not take me into her confidence. That is, she said nothing about the open sesame having mysteriously arrived. Maybe she wondered what it contained, but there was no way of getting into it without going to a locksmith, and it was a solid little affair. Besides, for her purpose, she did not need to get into it. She must have notified Cornwall that he had better use his influence, or it would be turned over to Walsh, who would be glad to use his influence. The same scrap of paper that told her it was from one of Steve's friends advised her to take the matter up with Walsh in case Cornwall did not show sufficient interest. I had realized, perhaps a little too late, that Walsh would probably think she had cheated him if she did call this attention to the box, for I had tampered a little with the contents. Usually I spent my evenings down in Commercial Alley over a poker table, just idly playing and having a little secret sport and making tin horns wonder why their plans went awry. One hot, sultry night I left early, went home, and, having a downstairs bedroom, left the hall door open to get a little more air. I shot the man who threw the glare of a dark lantern into my face from the doorway. I had an impression that there were two men. That is, I was sure I heard the rush and clatter of a man running. It wasn't the one I shot at. He was buried after being identified as a shyster lawyer. Perhaps he thought it better to go direct after loot than more safely to take it second-hand from his larcenous clients. Mrs. Ellis vaguely told me and the police that the thieves must have been after some papers. She kept her own counsel as far as I knew, and I asked no questions. I left Salt Lake almost at once, since I did not care for the attention that was coming my way, though of course the coroner did not hold me in the least responsible. I went back to San Francisco. I did not know what had happened in the case after I left, for I was kept rather busy with personal affairs of my own. But now the Cornwall brothers, after having told me about Steve Ellis, sat up as if jerked by wires when I inquired, "Whatever became of Mrs. Ellis?" For a moment or two, bony and loose-jointed Daniel looked as if I had hit him with a club, and the emaciated Joseph upset his glasses from off his nose in a quick dash to adjust them so as to peer the harder at me. "Mrs. Ellis!" Daniel exclaimed with a suddenness that had a suggestion of alarm in it. "How did you know?" the other Cornwall began and broke off chokingly. "Any time a man is vengeful, you can make sure there is a woman's shadow on him," I said smoothly, as if unaware that I had plucked at a veil they did not care to have disturbed. "But how did you know?" Daniel insisted with a sort of tentative suspicion, taking up his brother's question. 10 chances to a half a one, always, that it's a wife. If not a wife, then the daughter. "Daughter?" Joseph's voice was excitedly high-pitched. "Daughter," I repeated, nodding. Daniel was staring at me. He did not know what to think. I became aware that Joseph Cornwall, trembling from uplifted arms to his knees, was standing, and was almost speechless in his emotion. "I tell you Steve Ellis is a mean scoundrel," he shouted hoarsely. "A brute, sir. He killed his wife as surely as a man ever killed anything. I adopted Cora Ellis, sir, made her my heir. If he bothers her, he ought to be shot down like a dog, and I would like to do it." He ended with a fit of coughing. The man was grotesquely pitiful. He looked about as dangerous as a sparrow. His emotion was far too great for his body. He shook from weakness. I looked at him for a long time. If that was acting, it was extremely good acting, but I was not convinced. "Joseph is tender-hearted," Daniel put in as if explaining something. "I wondered what he thought he was explaining in such a tone of half-apology." "You didn't want me to do it," Joseph almost flared. "I see what it's got us into." "You know that has nothing to do with it. Steve Ellis hates me. Always has hated me." "Never shown any love for me either," Daniel replied. "But you tried to keep her from marrying him. Wanted to marry her yourself." There was much in his voice that sounded like a taunt. "I know he was jealous of me," the grotesque Joseph said defensively. His brother answered with mean scorn. "If he killed her, it wasn't because he was jealous of you. He was jealous for that tin-horn gambler that was living with her while he was in the pen." Daniel added a curse of his own against that tin-horn gambler. I inquired softly if Daniel had trouble with that fellow. It seemed that he had. He was rather vague and excited, but I gathered from his remarks that he had guessed the aforesaid tin-horn gambler had had something to do with a good deal of the trouble that came upon him about that time. He seemed to think, in spite of the intimation that Steve Ellis had had reason for hating the tin horn, that the fellow had been a friend of Steve's. I asked how Steve Ellis had brought about the death of his wife, but both of them were uncommunicative. They had questions of their own. I persisted. Daniel looked expectantly at his brother, and Joseph said that Ellis was sent up on circumstantial evidence. The woman was found dead less than 20 hours after he had been released from prison, her skull fractured. Now Steve Ellis was being again released. He had been released. Circumstantial evidence and all that, Joseph Cornwall explained exasperatedly, angrily, was the justification for letting him out. Daniel watched me closely and was silent. I remarked that it was strange, exceedingly strange. Then Daniel spoke. "That Walsh, Governor. He's letting him out." I understood something then of how it had come about. I said bluntly and with meaning that I might care to have a word or two with Steve Ellis when he arrived in New York. Daniel Cornwall continued to eye me a little broodingly, but Joseph was full of gratitude. As Daniel was pushing open the sliding doors, I caught sight of Quiller, looking quite haggard and anxious, waiting at the foot of the stairs. At the door, I glanced back over the shoulder of the nervous Joseph, who was aimlessly talkative, agitatedly polite. I saw Quiller gripping the arm of Daniel Cornwall. I heard his excited whisper as, without looking toward me, he pointed. His eyes were on the dazed face of Daniel. I caught the words, "The man that killed Taggart." The door closed behind me, and somewhat reflectively I went on my way. Taggart had been the name of the shyster lawyer who had, considering the ways and morals of his sort, taken a step toward honesty and turning burglar. His regeneration might eventually have been complete had he not awakened me. I had always thought there had been two of them that night, and the man with Taggart might have, in the tenseness of that moment when the stream of light fell on my face, got such a vivid glimpse of me as to recognize me on sight years later. Perhaps it was my face that had troubled his dreams. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording's in the public domain. Chapter 6. Several things happened simultaneously, and in rapid sequence. The Cornwall brothers quarreled, and Cora, overhearing them, learned such things as caused her to flee the house. Her haste to get from under that roof caused her to remove also a little black box which had been entrusted among her things. Daniel, in constant dread of thieves, had thought they would be unlikely to search her personal effects, and had her keep it for him. Daniel Cornwall, following the quarrel, also disappeared. When he discovered that I was the tin-horn gambler and the man who had shot Taggart, he thought he had caught the devil on his hook and was pretty much excited. He had sent Taggart and Quiller to try to get back that little steel box so as to avoid all delay, and if possible, obviate the need of having to let Steve Ellis get out of prison. Daniel had quarreled because he wanted to run and hide again, but Joseph, the weaker, younger, and least aggressive, stubbornly refused. His conscience seemed to have been a little easier. He had been traveling in the Orient at the time and had nothing at all to do with the affair. He was sick too, he said, and in no condition to play the fugitive, though he felt, and rightly enough I suppose, that Steve Ellis would kill him if he got the chance. Likely enough, he would make the chance. Take any sort of strong, bold man, throw him into prison twice, and he will probably come out of it desperate, dangerous, and reckless. As nearly as I could gather from what I heard and what I suspected, Ellis had not only been jealous of him, but held him almost equally responsible for the things that made him, Ellis, so eager for vengeance against the brother. So it was that Daniel Cornwall disappeared, taking Quiller with him. Quiller afterward came back to learn Cora's address with a view toward recovering the precious box. Joseph did not know it. He advised Quiller to come to my cousin or to me. Quiller lurked about until he got a word with Jack, but the word Jack gave him was to go to blank where he belonged. Quiller did not approach me, perhaps for fear that he might land in the same locality with Taggart. I smiled over all that excitement about the little black box, which, for all of its value and importance, had not been opened in years. But things happened rapidly. Shortly afterward, a battered body was found on the waterfront, and by clothes, papers, and purse was unquestionably identified as Daniel Cornwall's. The police got their hands on Quiller and held him in jail because he could tell no satisfactory story. And whenever a millionaire is murdered, the police insist on at least pretending to have the guilty party. Joseph was badly frightened and wanted to have Steve Ellis arrested, but nobody could find him. He had come to New York and he knew the Cornwall address. About the time the body was found, he had telephoned, demanding to see Cora. He swore that he would see his daughter. Joseph wrote me that Ellis was very angry about it. He said, in effect, that since Daniel was out of the way, the papers had given the tribute of headlines to the Salt Lake millionaire, he would ignore Joseph if he would do the right thing by the girl. Joseph, with the moneyed man's usual viewpoint, could not understand what Ellis meant by the right thing. How could a man, he wrote me plaintively, do more than he had for the girl?
"I am afraid he will kill her," the old man wrote.
His letter was not so much to give me explanations as to beg me to come to see him, and of course that meant to protect him. He was very broken up over Cora. Did I know where she was? I did. I knew more than that. I knew what she had overheard when the Cornwalls, not suspecting that she was bending above the top of the stairs, quarreled. She had fled in tears and anger and rage and bewilderment. She did not know where to go or what to do, but she wanted her father, whom she had thought was still in prison. She tumbled into a cheap rooming house, as it seemed to fit her humiliation as well as her purse. She scorned the Cornwall money. The old fellows had not been so generous in spending allowance, and sent for Jack Richmond. She confided with him, and he came breathless to repeat it to me. I called on her, but she was a little afraid of me. Yet she confirmed to me all that Jack had reported. She had overheard terrible things. She did not know what to do. In tears, she confessed that she had trapped Jack in the restaurant with the plea of no money and brought him home. The Cornwalls had forced her to do it. She seemed at that time to owe them so much that there was nothing which she would have refused to do for them, though it made her feel ashamed to lie. I understood. I had from the first understood all about the craft the Cornwalls thought they were using in getting in touch with me through Jack. I am an unsympathetic person, but having heard Cora's story, I was a little affected. She was a fine girl. I was convinced of that. I joined with Jack in urging her to go into better surroundings and to let us engage a companion for her. She refused. However, I did oppose Jack's insistence on marrying her forthwith. My impetuous cousin and I had an exchange of remarks. I tried to impress upon him that he would be a dunce to marry her before this trouble was over. He would have been, too. He exploded ill-temperedly and said many angry things. He wanted to marry her and have the legal right to tell the world to go hang and to break anybody's head that interfered with her. He wanted to lynch Cornwall single-handedly. He was furious enough to tell me I might bluff some people just because I could shoot quick and straight, but he didn't want any interference from me. Did I understand? I did, fully. I would not have had as much respect and liking for him if he had not been angry with me and said just the things he did say. There is much despicable in the man who shows common sense when in love. The ancients must have known it, for they pictured love as being blind. The fellow who calculates on whether or not a girl is trustworthy, whether or not he will have trouble on her account, is scarcely above the fellow who speculates on how much money he will make by the marriage. Jack told me to go to the devil, that he was going to marry her at once. But he didn't. She was in no mood for marriage. She was full of troubles and inwardly tormented. She refused to marry him or to accept help from him. There was no pose about it. She was going to work and earn back something of her self-respect. Jack was a likable fellow, though he might as well have carried his head under his arm for all the good it did him. And she no doubt loved him all the time, but did not quite realize it. Or maybe she did realize it. I don't know. Anyway, she refused to marry him. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording's in the public domain. Chapter 7. I called on Joseph and asked for the truth, though I already knew more than he could tell me. Having been a successful businessman, he was an adept at lying. In fact, he had begun his career by being admitted to the bar. With a tall glass of whiskey and water by the table, toward which his trembling hand went frequently, he tried to tell what he thought would arouse sympathy for him. It was impossible. Had he not been a feeble, sick old man, I would have made his life more miserable than it was by letting him know just how much I knew. What facts I did get from him were jerked rather than pride. It was offensive to me to hear him say that he had been in love with Mrs. Ellis almost from her girlhood. He had always been well off in money matters, but she chose to marry Steve Ellis, a big, drunken bully. So Joseph Cornwall said. He had never married. He tried to make me think that it was because of a sentimental attachment for Cora's mother, but he did not succeed. He had no relatives that he cared about. He got himself appointed Cora's guardian, made her his heir, though he had not legally adopted her. I tried to be honest, that is, as honest as a man can be without developing into one of those unprejudiced non-entities who look at all sides of a question and never let themselves be stirred by a fierce direct anger. But I did have to take into consideration that Joseph had been on a trip to the Orient during the time that I was in Salt Lake, and at the time of Mrs. Ellis's death. In fact, he had not returned until Ellis had been convicted of the murder. It was really his ill health that kept me from being brutal toward him. I've repeatedly said that he was an old man, but he wasn't in years. Somewhere around 45, I judged. But he was feeble and troubled by fears, if not by his conscience. He wanted my sympathy, my friendship, as he spoke of it. I told him rather ambiguously that most of my friends were crooks who took their chances boldly with the police, and he reached hurriedly for his whiskey, without understanding precisely what I meant. In the course of trying to gain my gratitude, he explained that his brother, suspecting the gambler who'd been staying at Mrs. Ellis's had had something to do with the theft of the little black box, had caused vicious reports of my presence there to be carried to Ellis in prison. Ellis was an inordinately jealous man, and the purpose of the lies had been to break up what friendship may have existed between Ellis and the man who called himself Smithers. The Cornwalls had learned through Quiller that Smithers and I were the same. Joseph explained several times that he and his brother, knowing my reputation and knowing that I was in New York, had thought to engage me to protect them from Steve Ellis, and Daniel had been terrified to discover that I had in Utah been known as Smithers. Joseph asked many questions, but he got no answers, or rather, no information. I did not give him Cora's address, and he could not give me Ellis's. Private detectives had kept him and his brother informed of Ellis's threats and movements after he was pardoned by that rascally Governor Walsh, but all track had been lost after he reached New York. "You have no idea, Mr. Everhard," he said, "what a wretchedly dishonest man Walsh is." It happened that I knew something of that, too. "I'm convinced," he went on, "that he pardoned Ellis just to have him hound my brother and me." "Why don't you strike back?" I demanded. "Strike back?" "Yes, ruin him." "What do you mean?" he asked anxiously, suspiciously. Then he blurted it out. "You got that box. You opened it. You're going to sell it to Walsh. I'll pay you more. I must have it. I'll have you arrested." Then he checked himself and tried to wipe out the threat of arrest by talking money again. I assumed a pose of puzzlement and twisted from him the admission that the box contained papers that would ruin Walsh. But, alas, Walsh had evidence that would injure the Cornwalls and ruin the name of his dead brother, who, another alas, was not alive to refute it. I assured him with sincerity, and for the time convinced him that I did not have a single paper or scrap of paper that belonged to his brother or referred to Walsh. He wanted to know where Cora was. He wanted to get hold of the little black steel box. It contained valuable documents. He explained how it came to be in Cora's possession. That must be returned to him. What could she have done with it? I could have told him what she had done with it, but I didn't. I could have told him that it was in my room, but I did not mention any such thing. I could have told him lots of things that would have surprised him. A few things, one at least, that would have nearly paralyzed him. I demanded to know why he thought Ellis might hurt the girl. Cornwall tried to be rather vague. He really did succeed in a way, but it seemed that Ellis had been enraged when she permitted him, Joseph Cornwall, to make her his heir. Why should he have felt that way? Cornwall was perturbed by that line of questioning. He evaded anything more definite than to say Ellis had always hated him because of Mrs. Ellis. That old fellow had not had his legal training in vain. He was good at subtleties, lies, and evasions. I could have rocked him, knocked the props from under him in 20 words, but there seemed to be no reason just then for crushing what little spirit, if not life, that he had left. The affair was far from being ended, and I thought that after I had had a talk with Steve Ellis, if I could ever locate that fellow, I would know more of what I ought to do. I may pause to admit that my income is not so large as I sometimes wish it, and on occasion I have been known to use a little of what looks suspiciously like blackmail. I haven't many weaknesses as sentiment, but two things always arouse my sympathies: sick dogs and crippled children. Before I finished with Joseph, I expected to see a large subscription go to a certain children's hospital. Perhaps I would sell him the little black box. But more important motives than that were, of course, behind my interest. I am fairly likely to want to meddle, though I do not always do so, wherever it appears that rank injustice has been done. I had not only liked Mrs. Ellis, I liked Cora also, and if she were coming into my family as Jack's wife, as there was no doubt that she would, for Jack was a youth who got what he wanted, I had good justification for taking the trouble to interfere in the complications that affected her. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. My justification increased almost immediately. Somebody nearly killed Cora Ellis. She was, in spite of all that Jack could do, still living in that cheap rooming house. Somebody entered the room at night and nearly fractured her skull with a blow. Her mother had been killed in the same way, a blow to the head while she lay in bed. But Cora was not killed, though her condition was serious. Concussion of the brain, I believe the doctor said. She was carried to the hospital dangerously near death. Her name got into the papers. More than that, pretty much the whole story eventually got there. Jack could then use his money to give her comfort and help. If there had been anything she needed that money could not buy, I suppose he would have gone out and stolen it. He got in a regiment of doctors and special nurses, had her put into a private room, and made a fuss because it wasn't good enough. Also, he ordered that nobody should be permitted to see her and had somebody on watch outside of her door as well as in. He was excited and thorough. She had evidently been assaulted by someone intent upon recovering the little black steel box. Her whereabouts had probably been discovered by the simple method of shadowing Jack, who had visited her on an average of something like twice a day. Perhaps only on an average of once, but had stayed the rest of the day, had gone out with her, carried her off to shows and cafes, and succeeded a little in distracting her attention from the need of a job. The room was ransacked, but the little box was not found. She did not have it. She had given it to Jack to return to the Cornwalls. He had brought it home to wrap for a messenger, and I, with deceptive consideration, told him I would attend to it for him. It was a heavy little thing, being solidly built, and without a key one would have trouble getting it open. Daniel Cornwall had evidently known that. I counted on his knowing, as he also knew very well what papers it had, and as he could tell whether or not the lock had been tampered with, he had apparently had no occasion to look them over. Perhaps he had been too much of a miser to have a new key made. Anyway, I didn't get into it. I did not try. I stowed it away with care in my own room. As a matter of principle, or lack of it as you prefer, it is always well to have the Joker up one's sleeve. That little box to me represented most emphatically the Joker. I did rather wish that I could peep inside of it again, but it was too much trouble to have the sturdy little lock forced. Besides, not even Daniel Cornwall or Walsh knew better than I what it contained. I wished very much to get in touch with Steve Ellis. For one thing, that blow intended for his daughter's head had a deadly similarity to the other which had sent him to prison. There was only circumstantial evidence, it was true, but there seemed to be other reasons than inadequate evidence that had decided Walsh to sign his pardon. Jack came home one evening with an air of excitement.
"Say, what'd you know about it? A gink showed up today and tried to raise a rumpus 'cause they wouldn't let him in. Said he was her father. No, it wasn't the Cornwall dyspeptic. He telephoned. I didn't see the fella. Told him if he showed up again to hold him and yell for the police. Cora's getting along fine, but no excitement, say the doctors. They've got to say something to make me think they're earning their money. But when they tried to limit me to 15 minutes, say, I'd like to know what business a doctor I'm paying has got telling me how long I can talk to my girl. Oh, the father person? They told him to drop around tomorrow and see me. Ellis did come around the next day, but the hospital people, in trying to follow Jack's advice about holding him and calling in the police, aroused his suspicions, and he got away. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording's in the public domain. Chapter 9. Then came one of those disagreeable surprises that are sometimes called bolts out of a clear sky, though the sky had not, as one may judge from what had been told, seemed so very clear. Anyway, pretty much of the whole affair got into the newspapers, and on top of that, Joseph Cornwall appeared to have tried to get security from Ellis by telling him that I had been known as Smithers in Salt Lake. Ellis probably believed he had more reason to be jealous of me than of Joseph Cornwall, and Ellis had no way of knowing at all that I had done him a bit of a service. Or maybe that old scoundrel of a Joseph Cornwall had thought that by forcing Ellis's attention on me, he would cause me to dispose of him. I knew this had happened because Ellis wrote me a very abusive letter saying he had found out that I was Smithers, that he didn't care how bad my reputation was as a gunman. He would get me, and he wanted me to know it, that I would pay for having done Daniel Cornwall's dirty work. It seems to be a very stupid characteristic of almost everybody bent on relieving a grudge to send a warning, an abusive warning. I don't know why it is so, but it is. I suppose it's related to the passion for abusing an enemy that is so marked in savages. The only thing about the letter that gave me a second's pause, and it was a rather long letter full of abuse and some illumination as to how he had discovered who I was
was the accusation that I'd done Daniel Cornwall's dirty work. I suppose that Joseph had added that lie to draw Ellis's lightning more inevitably upon my head. I was more irritated by the newspapers than by anything else. Jack, in a moment of idiocy, had let the reporters get the best of him. True enough, those fellows are likely to get the best of anybody, and it is no trick at all for a pack of them, sharp-eyed, wily-tongued, lightning-witted, to turn a young, emotional lover inside out. They'd got him to talk about Cora. I won't say that he had sense enough not to tell them what she had heard when the Cornwalls had quarreled. He probably forgot that completely at the time. He told them pretty much everything else. He said that Cora's room had evidently been robbed in an effort to secure the little box of important papers which she had previously turned over to him and he had returned to the Cornwalls. No, he did not know what the box contained. He, the idiot, told of Cora's father and her semi-adoption by the millionaire Joseph Cornwall. The newspapers flared. Joseph Cornwall denied having received the box. The papers clamored to know what was in it and speculated in headlines. The recent murder or suicide of Daniel was rehashed. By a system of elimination and deduction, they concluded that I had the box. They were encouraged to this conviction by Joseph Cornwall, who seemed to have lost his own head too. I was always good copy. All in all, it was a whale of a story. I was pestered for a statement, but I said nothing. Long dispatches from Salt Lake added sensational information to the local stories. It was a muddle and a mess, and those hounds of the press left no stones unturned. I put on my best poker face and let them guess whatever they would. I did succeed in impressing upon Jack that he had made a fool of himself. I also told him if he so much as breathed a word of what Cora had told him and me of why she fled the Cornwalls, I would see to it that she never did marry him in case, as was unlikely, she ever forgave him herself. The papers were frantic to discover that point, but they did not succeed. It was one matter upon which Joseph was equally desirous of silence. I gave out nothing to papers or to the police, and though the latter rather looked askance at me, they did not make any formal inquiries. Joseph evidently did not want to take legal steps to recover the box and its contents, though he was now sure I was a liar, since for fear I might give the documents publicity, I told him I had no papers of his brother's, or of Walsh's. That would hit Walsh hardest, it is true, but it would also cause Walsh, Samson-like, to pull down the Cornwall reputation, if not even to do violence to Joseph himself. I did not say anything to the newspapers or to the police, even when Yang Li, the mute Chinaman who attended to the rather large apartment Jack and I shared, was knocked unconscious while answering a call at the door. Again that blow over the head, the same that had killed Mrs. Ellis, nearly killed Cora, and, glancing a bit, narrowly spared Yang from more than a severe bump. True, 3 different men could have struck as many different blows, but it looked much as if someone was putting its trust in a club. My rooms were searched. Had the party who invaded the apartment looked into the dictionary, which I'd carefully hollowed out, he might have been satisfied, though I doubt it. Anyway, he would have found the little black steel box just as I had received it. On the same day, I received a telegram from the secretary to the governor of Utah. The governor had evidently been reading the papers and New York dispatches. The telegram requested me to meet the governor at such and such a hotel 30 minutes after his train arrived on the following Thursday. Even I, who have had some experience in the ways of the world and its troubles, was beginning to feel a little bewildered at the rapidity with which complications were developing. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. I wanted to meet Steve Ellis. It had been made plain that he wanted to meet me, so nothing would have been more simple than the making of an appointment, if I had known where he was or how to reach him. I doubted whether Ellis paid attention to the personals in the newspapers. Probably did not search them out as many city men do over the breakfast coffee, young brokers and clerks hoping to find themselves somehow identified as the man the lady in blue with the merry widow hat wishes to meet again, or some such romantic nonsense. Besides, it would have been impossible to say much in such a personal without letting all the reporters in the city in on the appointment. However, I thought I could use the reporters. I permitted them to think I was trying to retire, to evade them, to escape publicity, to hide, when I moved over to the Jersey side and took a modest little cottage, such as I hoped would encourage midnight prowlers to come and call on me. The reporters, thinking of course that they had something I did not want known, managed to get my new address into their follow-up stories on the Cornwall case. The important thing was that Jack, this time acting under instructions, intimated to them that the little black steel box went with me. It had come to the point where it seemed that I would have to offer myself as bait to catch the sort of fish I was after. I had taken the small furnished cottage with an idea toward encouraging the sort of people who probably thought I did not want to see them to pay me unexpected calls. I made a few minor alterations in the arrangement of the furniture and hangings and waited. The first to come arrived boldly in the daylight. Yang Li, standing behind the curtains near the door, took a long look at the fellow and shook his head. Yang was telling me that this was not the man who had cracked him over the head when he had opened the door 2 days before. The man knocked, and I called to him to come in. He hesitated, but came. He was a person of no importance, probably a cross between a lawyer and a private detective, and had been sent by Joseph Cornwall to buy the little black box. He acted as if he were being vastly generous in offering $10,000 for the box. I said I would not consider less than $30,000. He protested. I told him the price was now $40,000. He gasped. I assured him that the value of the box had gone up to $50,000. He almost shouted that I must be crazy. For the insult, I added another $10,000. I always did think that I had the making of a financier in me. He offered $40,000, but my price had jumped to $70,000, and I was courteous enough to assure him that every attempt to bicker or beat down my price would make it rise again. He lost his temper, so I came out flatly for $100,000. Go back to Cornwall, I said, and ask him how much he thinks I could get for the box by offering it at auction in Salt Lake. Of course, the fellow did not know the story and value of the box, but he was a little shaken. He thought his gift of legal rhetoric could influence me. He snapped blackmailer, and the price mounted 10%. He began to get rattled and asked, "You will take $100,000 then?" "No," I told him. "It is $120,000 now, and if you open your mouth to object again, it'll be $130,000, so the best thing you can do is to get out."
"But if my client wants to pay it,"
he almost wailed. Evidently, he had been instructed to get the box if money could buy it. "Then tell him to come in person. In person, mind you, next Thursday at 2:35 promptly with a cashier's check for $130,000 made out to Mr. J.C. Collins to the Suite C of the Treborn Hotel. He is to notify me by tomorrow whether or not he will accept, or else I may offer my box for sale in Salt Lake." Mr., or rather Dr. J.C. Collins, was a friend of mine, and a devoted enthusiast who gave all his time and most of his money to the Star of Hope Hospital, an institution for crippled children. And bless his soul, he had no scruples about tainted money. He believed that when it went into bandages and braces for children, even the smell of coal oil would be cleansed from it. I had already engaged the suite as a fitting place to let the governor of Utah interview me. Maybe he had already taken by telegraph the precaution of engaging a room. Maybe not. He was, no doubt, a little excited. Anyway, it would make no difference. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The following afternoon, Thursday, we had another visitor. It seemed that in spite of my calculations and rather queer precautions, our visitors were coming in the daylight. Yang, from his tireless station behind the curtains, saw the man walk hesitantly up and down the sidewalk before our house, and glance continually, indecisively toward it. Yang attracted my attention, and I peeked through a corner of the window. That was undoubtedly a fellow I wanted to see. I hurried to a chair and sprawled into it. Shortly I heard a hard rap on the door. I called out, "Come in!" The door did not open. I called out again. Then it opened slowly, and Mr. Steve Ellis filled the doorway. He was a big man with sharp, definite features, slow in his movements and deliberate. He did not need to speak for one to know that he was embittered. But his voice, though not loud, had a kind of husky insolence. He wore a felt hat of light gray that he took off reluctantly in the doorway. He was a little uneasy but not nervous. His fingers were steady. His coat was of dark brown material and double-breasted. He closed the door by reaching out behind his back and did not take his eyes off me. "Won't you sit down?" I asked. "No." He glanced about a little furtively. No one was in sight. My hands rested on the arms of the chair. "You are Mr. Ellis, I believe. I've been expecting you." He made a slight start of surprise. Yes, I'm Steve Ellis. You're that fellow Smithers? It was a cross between an accusation and a question. I've used that name, yes. And you call yourself Everhard, too. Again the suggestion of a question with an undertone of contempt. You came looking for trouble? I asked. That rather surprised him, but after a pause, after a moment of study, he said between clenched teeth, Yes, you dirty little tin-horn four-flusher. I come looking for trouble. I'm going to give you the beating of your life. I did not move, though he leaned forward as if to rush. With a suggestion of sarcasm, I replied, I see. You find out that a man weighs about 50 pounds less than you and decide to beat him up. I believe that the prison system is designed to teach a man such caution, is it not? He replied by swearing at me and bracing himself as if to jump. He was considerate enough, however, to tell me that there was just one way that I could escape being beaten up. That was to give him the little black steel box. Indeed. He cursed me. He was rather infuriated because I did not seem to be frightened. He told me that he would have killed me, but he had promised the governor not to kill anybody. I see. Governor Walsh let you out on condition that you would steal for him. You keep that talk up and I'll... He did not finish what he would do. He stopped. Just why do you think you would like to try to kill me? He assured me that I knew, and then went on to mention his wife. And so, I said coldly, you killed her. I did not, he shouted. I never touched her. God, I loved her. I told him that a lot of love he must have had when he eagerly believed lies that made her out to be disreputable. Don't preach to me, he cried. Preach to you? Preach to the devil, sir. If it be preaching to say that you are a jealous coward and cur, make the most of it. You had only one friend while you were in the pen, and that was your wife. And when you came out, you killed her because she had to let rooms to keep from going hungry. And you bargained with a crooked governor for a pardon. He threw back his coat and jerked at a gun handle. Of course you are ready to shoot a man you think unarmed. I had not moved. My legs were extended before the chair. My hands were on the chair's arms. Try it and see how many policemen pounce onto you. He looked about almost hurriedly. I smiled. You are very simple and a little stupid. Don't you know the police are looking for you? Don't you know I came here so you'd think it was easy to find me alone? I got your letter and your threats. Do you think I would be here alone to receive a wife murderer? Again he cursed me, but he did not offer to shoot. He rammed the gun angrily into the holster and looked about, a little dazed. I didn't kill Dan Cornwall, he said with something of hopelessness in his voice. He had read the papers. He knew why the police wanted him. I asked him just what he had meant by saying that I did Daniel Cornwall's dirty work and got out of him the belief that I had been one of Cornwall's gunfighters. He had several of them to jump copper claims and that sort of thing. Who had told him that I did Cornwall's dirty work? Why, one of the guard in the penitentiary, the same guard that had told him stories about his wife. The guard knew me for one of Cornwall's spies and gunmen. Cornwall had showed a good deal of cunning when he bought that guard. Do you know how you came to be paroled that time? You were paroled, weren't you? Pardoned then, too. You seemed to be rather fortunate in getting pardons. He said that he had been sent over on a frame-up, that he had been in Cornwall's employ and refused to carry out some crooked work. A friend of his had had a claim. Cornwall wanted it jumped. Ellis said that he had sworn he would stand by his friend. Cornwall had trumped up a theft charge and sent him over. I asked why he had supposed that the fellow called Smithers would have killed the man Taggart, sent to burglarize Mrs. Ellis's house, if he too had been one of Cornwall's men. He didn't, or said he didn't, know Taggart had been sent by Cornwall. He claimed that he didn't know what Taggart had been after, that he had thought Taggart was after Smithers. I called him a liar, and he quivered as if jabbed with a hot piece of iron. Do you know how you came to get out of prison that time? Walsh. He was Attorney General then, tipped off the governor. He knew about the frame-up on me. Walsh told me himself this last time. By digging into him with questions, I discovered, though I was for a moment rather of the opinion that he lied, that Mrs. Ellis had sent word only that she had got hold of something that would help toward his pardon. He never knew what it was. His wife had been killed the day he got out. I knew very well that he had not killed her and was rather predisposed to favor his side of the case, though in my opinion it was not much worse to murder a wife than to believe a blackguard's lies about her. She had not, he said, told him of having the little steel box Cornwall so treasured, though he had been with her most of the day. That night he had gone downtown to see a man about a job. After the man had refused to give him the job, he walked about the streets for hours, worried and brooding. When he got home, his wife was dead. He couldn't explain where he had been. The guard in the penitentiary swore he, Ellis, had said he would get both his wife and that fellow Smithers. Ellis admitted he had threatened Smithers, never his wife. The ways of woman are strange, incomprehensible. I could not understand why Mrs. Ellis had not mentioned the black box to him. But I eventually learned, or learned enough to surmise, that Daniel Cornwall had, when she was using it as a lever to make him pry Ellis from the prison, exacted from her the promise to tell no one that she had it. She had kept her promise. It appeared from what I also learned that Mrs. Ellis, who had no liking for the Cornwalls and wisely trusted them not at all, had said she would not surrender the box until Daniel Cornwall admitted that he had framed up the case against her husband. That is a rather important point as explaining many things that would otherwise be obscure. She was perfectly right in her attitude. She was a fine woman. In the course of our talk, Ellis acknowledged unconsciously by his manner that I had rather bluffed him. He sat down and fumbled with his hat brim. He answered my questions with a kind of monotonous hopelessness of tone, as if it were useless to think of fighting his luck. I next found out how he had come to know that Cornwall set such store by the box. You told Mrs. Ellis that if he could be got, Cornwall could be made to do anything. How did you know it? He explained that once he, Cornwall, and Cornwall's secretary were taking a little trip, and the secretary carried the little black box. "If you ever get in trouble with the old man," said the secretary half-jokingly at first, "get your mitts onto this box. I mean it, Steve. Nobody's ever seen the inside of it as I know of. Between you and me, I think the old man's got the dope on somebody, and he thinks more of this box than of his bank account. I'm giving you a real tip, Steve. Just nail this box if you see trouble coming. But the old man never lets it get far away from him." I thought that over carefully and concluded that it might be true, then changed the conversation to Joseph Cornwall. "That skunk," Ellis exclaimed. "He spread around that I was a drunk and I don't know what all. I've been drunk. Every man has. He tried to get my wife to leave me, then he got my daughter. How do you suppose a man feels having his daughter take up with skunks like that just because they're rich? Her mother would disown her, and her mother loved her more than anything on earth." His voice almost broke at that. "Ellis," I told him, more gently than I usually speak to anyone, "most men's troubles in this world come because they trust women. You've caught it the other way around. Cora never knew the truth about the Cornwalls. Your wife never told her. At least, not enough to brace her up against their lies and what she mistook for generosity. You see, they are a bad lot, but Joseph knows he's sick and likely to die one of these days, and a little bit of conscience has been fermenting down inside him. Maybe he did hoodwink himself into believing that he really loved Mrs. Ellis, though I doubt it, and so wanted to show kindness to her daughter. But let me tell you this. Cora went out of that house just as soon as she found what kind of a deal they had framed up against you. She found out some other things, too, Ellis, and I'm not going to tell you or anybody till the telling means something more than mere information. But she wants you. She wants you more than she does a rich cousin of mine who is trying to marry her. Now who do you suppose could have struck her over the head?" He answered promptly that it was some one of the Cornwall's dirty workers, and hurried on to insist that I tell him everything about Cora. We had a long talk about one thing and another, and in the course of the conversation I told him that I knew positively that Mrs. Ellis had been given the little black box at the time she was working for his pardon. He doubted me. "Couldn't some of your friends have got it for her?" "Mister," he fumbled over my name, not knowing what to call me, and repeated, "Mister, I ain't got any friends. None of 'em would have done anything for me. Walsh, it's some stuff on him that Cornwall had in that box. He told me he wasn't doing it for friendship. He said Cornwall had some evidence that would ruin him, but he'd got to the place where Cornwall could ruin and be... He said he was going to come clean. There was an awful roar over his pardoning me, but he said he was convinced I hadn't touched my wife and that he was going to follow his conscience, and the Cornwalls and everybody else could go to the devil." "You are sure of that?" "I know it. He said it to me right in his own office. He said the Cornwalls had been afraid, ever since he got in office, that he would cut loose and get 'em. That's why they got out of Utah, but they could ruin him. That little black box will be my coffin, he said, and I knew right away what he meant. I remembered from the time when I'd seen it. You see, mister, Cornwall sent him a picture of that box and a key once, and a note. Walsh told me all about it, saying he wanted Walsh to have a key to that box, because what was in it really belonged to him, and he might want to open it sometime in court to show what a fine, upstanding citizen he was. Sarcastic note it was. Walsh told me all about it. He was excited. And when I saw in the papers all about you having it, I thought I could do the governor a good turn. Besides, old Joe Cornwall told me you was Smithers. I don't know why I'm telling all this to you. I'm no friend of yours, except if you have been good to my girl. Now call in the blank police you got stuck around here. I thought I'd fight it out if I ever got cornered again, but I'll give up. I'm innocent this time, too, though I wish to God I was guilty. I'd give my soul any day to kill Dan Cornwall. I assured him that he was unduly agitated, that there were no police about. He was dazed a little at that and stared around. I told him that if he wished to do something for the governor, to be at the Treybourne Hotel, Suite C, Thursday at 2:35 p.m. Be there promptly and come right in. I'll give you the little black still box and you can give it to the governor. He'll be there too. Now, don't look at me that way. You know it isn't a trap. As for traps, if my little withered old Chinese servant hadn't shaken his head as you came up the walk, you would now know how it feels to be trapped. You see, somebody hit him over the head recently, and we are waiting for that person to call again. I rather wondered if, after all, it had not been you. A little grateful, much bewildered, and scarcely knowing whether or not he was dreaming, Ellis got out of the house. In his hand he carried a little slip of paper upon which I had written his Thursday's appointment. He would, at least, have that to assure him that he had not been dreaming. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. I could have told him that Cora had been doing fine. I did tell him that, without adding that she had been out for a ride in Jack's limousine the day before. I could have told him some other things that would have been of extreme importance, but when one has for so many years kept his own counsel and arranged his little affairs with an eye for the dramatic, perhaps for the melodramatic, one is likely to have no scruples about keeping from people things they have a right to know. When Joseph Cornwall sent me word that he would meet me at the Treybourne, I sent back as an answer that he would do nothing of the kind, unless the cashier's check had been put into my hands. I was pretty sure that he would not send the money beforehand, though in that answer I conveyed that I had already got in touch with other interested parties out west. I wanted, however, to be sure to have Joseph at the hotel. I should have preferred to have had Daniel Cornwall, of course. There are various ways of getting what one wants, and though many of my most carefully laid plans have been futile, I have occasionally been quite successful. For one thing, I have never hesitated in life, or in the lesser gamble of games defined by Hoyle, to play with marked cards. That may seem a contemptible thing to admit, but I never saw an honest poker player yet who wasn't eventually trimmed by cheaters. Though, by way of keeping my hand in with a revolver, I toss pennies into the air and hit them. Yet I do not go about picking quarrels with quiet, honest folk, and though I can do some very nearly unbelievable things with cards, I have never yet cleaned out a man who played honestly. Understand me, for I have no desire to whitewash myself. If a man who can afford to lose gets into a game, and he's no personal friend of mine, and I happen to have some use for more money than I have, he's pretty likely to complain of his luck. But to get back to my story. By Wednesday evening I had begun to feel a little impatient. As I had been doing every evening, I left the doors unlocked, the rear windows open, and the screen unlatched. I drew the blinds and rigged out a kind of dummy that threw a passable silhouette against the shade, while Yang hovered in the shadows of the front porch, sheltered by vines, and I lurked patiently as an Indian in a pantry. As usual, nothing came of our precautions, so about 10 o'clock, with much care in case we were being watched, the dummy was dismantled. I took its place for a moment, then arose and went into my bedroom and undressed. Then Yang turned out the lights. Whoever has watched the night out, sleeplessly listening, I care not how strong his nerves, evokes a feeling of the eerie. With every sense strained to catch sounds, one hears much creaking and rustling, and it is very easy to believe in ghosts. Phantoms seem to flicker in the darkness before one's tense eyes, and the over-alert ears report all manner of faint, suspicious noises. I was alone in the house, not that being alone at all disturbed me, but even I, who am sometimes thought to be without emotion, am much more susceptible than I will admit to the startling effect of solitary intense darkness. Each night after he turned out the lights, Yang left the house, and Had anyone taken the trouble to follow him, that person would have been convinced that he did not return until morning, for Yang was very subtle and elusive. On that Wednesday night I was more tense than ever, for on previous nights I had very nearly exhausted my imagination by wondering what could and might have happened at the multiple appointments I planned at the Treyborn. Besides, this was my last night before those appointments were to be kept, and all whom I wanted to be present had not been invited. Around 1 o'clock I heard something a little more marked than the usual inexplicable creaking that gave me many false thrills. Silence. My imagination had played a trick, or at least I so accused it. The sky was cloudy, and there was neither moon nor stars. The room was inky, but one's eyes grow vaguely accustomed to the thickest blackness. Again the creaking as of a cautious foot placed on the back porch. Then silence. An interminable silence. I bent forward, ears strained, and for the briefest of moments I caught a vague streak of light that sifted beneath the door. Somebody was in the house. He had moved with an infinite caution and silence. Again silence. The person was listening. I held my breath for a second or two, fearful that he might become alarmed and retreat. Then I knew. I could not see, I scarcely heard, that the door into my bedroom was opening. It did not creak. I had oiled it with care and also taken the precaution of laying rugs and mats where it seemed they would be most likely to serve the intruder's purpose. After the door opened, the prowler stood for many minutes, silent, waiting, listening. He had the patience of a hunting animal. Then came an almost noiseless step nearer to the bed, distinguished a little by the white spread. I could catch the faint creaks of the strained boards. There are few floors that do not creak a little. One may live in a house for years and never know it, but turn out the lights and try to move inaudibly across the room, and the boards seem maliciously to squeak a warning, though it really may be impossible for one in the next room to hear. Step by step, with a full minute or two after each short advance, the figure came nearer and nearer to the bed. There was a pause as he stood at the foot. Then he half crouched and came alongside inch by inch. I am by nature rather unemotional, seldom nervous, but I felt a queer little chill pass along my back as I wondered whether he would strike with club or knife. At last there flashed on the bed a blinding stream of light from an electric torch. With incredible swiftness, the man brought down the uplifted loaded cane against the pillow. There was a dull, crunching, smashing sound, and the torch was shut off. The blow had shattered the little mannequin, and at that instant I switched on the light. "Thank you," I said with extreme politeness. The man looked like a preacher. Had the earth given way under his feet and landed him before the satanic throne, he could not have been more stunned. I stood there, my hands empty, smiling, thanking him. His clothes were black and formal. He wore a stiff white shirt and a little black clerical tie. His rather leathery, flabby face wore side whiskers. A parochial black hat was on his head. He was in his stocking feet. His mouth was open, and his hands and arms were frozen into a gesture of recoil. Amazement and terror burned in his widened eyes. "Thank you," I repeated, "for taking the trouble to prove to me precisely what I suspected. First there was Mrs. Ellis, then Cora, then my Chinaman, and now myself. Each time all because of a little black box, which no honest man would give 10 cents for, and—" Wordless, he hurled himself at me, the loaded cane coming down. I stepped to one side, snatched at the holster fastened to the curtains behind which I had been standing, and in the twinkling of a second had reminded him of the fate that befell Taggart when engaged on a similar errand some years before. At my suggestion, he dropped the cane to the floor. Then he cursed me. When he paused, I urged him to go on, explaining to him that I enjoyed listening to compliments. Naturally, that made him more furious. In the awkward way that men have when unaccustomed to the use of guns, he pushed back his coat and tugged at his hip pocket. I had replaced my own in the holster, and I did not take the trouble to reach for it. I sharply told him to put up his hands. Had he refused, I probably would have killed him. "Look here," I began businesslike. "I don't want to hurt you. I'm not going to call the police. Now put your hands down and keep your fingers away from your hip pocket, and let us talk things over like sensible men." My words and attitude were almost as bewildering a surprise as when I had turned on the light. "Why do you suppose I've held up that box?" I demanded. "Hasn't it been very apparent that I needed money?
outside of some people like you and the governor of Utah, who is not rich, who would bid for it. I move off to an obscure little house and get the address put into the papers so you could more easily find it."
"How did you know?" he began, his voice shaking.
"I knew you would come. You went to Mrs. Ellis, to Cora, to my Chinaman."
"How did you know?"
he began again, but I interrupted him. "All that is of no importance. Let's talk of money. My price is now $130,000 for the box. Will you pay it?" He protested that it would be impossible. Having got on to familiar ground, money matters, he became a bargainer. I told him that it would no doubt be inconvenient, but not impossible. Anyway, for that sum I would put the box into his hands, unopened, and just as it was when he had seen it last. Otherwise it would be refused him. We argued, or rather he did. I said he could fix up whatever explanation pleased him to satisfy his lawyers and bank, but I had to have the money, cash, by tomorrow, or rather by this afternoon. I told him he would have to be at Sweet Sea of the Treyborn Hotel at 2:50 promptly. How did he know it wasn't a trap? He knew it very well, I told him, because he could not imagine how I could possibly lay a better trap than the one in which he had just been caught. I explained that I knew very well he would come, for since I was onto his secret, not even millions could save him from exposure unless he silenced me and got his box. "You don't dare run off and hide and lose your identity altogether, for you are an old man. Not in the best of health either, are you? No, and you would be hounded out and couldn't touch your money without revealing your true identity, and couldn't reveal that without being caught." As a matter of fact, the elusive and subtle Yang did return each night after his seeming departure to patiently stand watch for the purpose of shadowing anyone who left house. Yang could have shadowed a ghost, so I was not taking nearly the risk that I seemed to be in letting the clerical gentleman go his way.
"How did you know?"
he began for the third time, as if obsessed with some peculiar desire for information. But again I cut the question short, half maliciously. "I know much more than most people give me credit for. For instance, I know that you will be at the Treyborn this afternoon with the money. Don't interrupt me. I know you will be there, for this evening I expect to have dinner with the governor of Utah. Yes, if you hadn't been too, I don't know whether to call it cunning or stingy, to have kept your private detectives in Salt Lake telegraphing news, you would have known that he left quietly for New York recently. Yes or no? Will you be there at 2:50 sharp? Yes or no?"
"Yes,"
he said huskily. Though he was a double-dyed liar and criminal, I felt sure that he would keep the appointment. Though he might not intend to keep it, I felt sure that he would be there. I like to plan little dramatic affairs, and in this case I had taken certain precautions. Anyway, he promised. He brought in his shoes from the back porch, put them on, and left by the front door at about 3 o'clock. I went to bed and sleep, very contented with myself and full of faith in the slim, wraith-like Chinaman who, though I had not seen or signaled to him, I knew was following the clerical figure and would follow no matter where or which way he went. End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recordings in the public domain. Chapter 13. I found an hour, or maybe not so long a time as that, of Thursday afternoon quite interesting. There were one or two little variations to my plans, but nothing of importance. Joseph Cornwall arrived before any of my other guests. He came with 2 or 3 private detectives and a lawyer, obviously intending to trap me in a little game of blackmail. I knew that was in the air almost as soon as I saw him creeping from the automobile, solicitously assisted by 2 fellows who could no more have proclaimed themselves detectives if they had worn their tin badges as shirt studs instead of concealing them under their coats. An experienced blackmailer like myself understands pretty much the risks he must take. In spite of my assurance that I would not meet him unless he had previously delivered $130,000 into my hands, he came, and I had not yet received the money. I really hadn't expected to get it, for one must demand a great deal more in this world than one hopes for. I mean, I had not expected to get it in advance, for Joseph Cornwall, being a certain kind of rich man, would not part with money without some hope not only of getting what he bargained for, but of getting what he paid. His 2 detectives and the lawyer, not the same little flunky-like lawyer person that had called on me, but another, a more important-looking legal person, whispered in the lobby for a moment,
Then followed the bellboy, who came forward and offered to show them to Suite C. The bellboy was intelligent and attending to business, as I had noticed from my place behind the palms. Joseph and his party were scarcely out of sight before Steve Ellis came in nervously, looking a little lost, but having made up his mind to see it through, whatever it might be. I went up to him and asked him to sit down and wait a minute. I told him that Governor Walsh had already arrived and was in his room, that the governor would be down in a few minutes looking for me, as I had sent up word that I was waiting. I asked Ellis to receive the governor for me, and I glanced at my watch. Bring him up to Suite C in just 8 minutes. But I thought, don't think, I told him. It isn't necessary today. Have the governor up there in 8 minutes. I left him and hurried upstairs. I met Jack watching me in the hall. He was excited, but trying not to be. I'm afraid the nervous shock, he began. What, a rich man afraid? I taunted him. Don't worry, your own doctors have told me it would be all right. Besides, Dr. Lingard had a proper dramatic sense, rather unusual in a physician. I had no sooner said that than Dr. J.C. Collins of the Children's Hospital, a tall, alert, tense fellow with a kind of sad humor in his eyes, always in his eyes, elbowed Jack aside and almost trembling in excitement, said, Look here, Don Everhard, are you sure we're not going too far this time? If I should be arrested? Scandal. Hurt the hospital, you know. Need the money, but... Have you got your machine ready? The driver's ready to go. All set? Yes, but... I silenced him with a gesture and said, Every bed in your hospital is a battlefield. Are you going to run the chance of losing a lot of battles there for fear of a little risk here now? That touched his weakest spot. He was really a fanatic over his children, and he did need money. Had he had billions, that lover of children, that crusader against treacherous, cowardly diseases that attacked babies and children, would still have needed money. He clenched his long, sensitive surgical fingers and said tensely, Go on, I'll go through with it. I stepped into Suite C and closed the door. In my most business-like manner, I faced the little delegation and cast a quick look at the burly-faced detective who lounged idly against the table, his elbow on a large dictionary. Joseph Cornwall was sitting in a deep plush chair, and the rather pompous legal person was close beside him, whispering into the nervous old millionaire's ear. The money, I said bluntly. The lawyer person glanced right and left at the two detectives. They straightened up and took a step forward, waited. Then he began to speak. That is, he cleared his throat, paused impressively, and then began to say that he represented his client. The money or the cashier's check, now, or I go out of that door. You should have sent it before. The lawyer, his name was Parsons, began to ask me if I was sure that I really wanted the bargain to go on. I cut him with a dozen words, saying that if I wanted his advice, I would have engaged him. That made him angry, and he puffed. The determination to make me regret my impudence came over his face and stayed there. You will kindly sign this receipt, he said, offering me a piece of paper. I sign no receipt until the money is paid. Yet, he said with a swelling of his chest, you expect my client to pay his money out without being assured of receiving the object of purpose. He can have the object all right. How do we know it, sir? Demanded Parsons with further expansive chest. Because I said so. Oh. It was as insulting as he could make it. The governor of Utah is in this hotel. I meet him in 5 minutes. If I haven't your money by that time, you, Cornwall, will probably go to the penitentiary for perjury and conspiracy. For sheltering a guilty man when you knew that Steve Ellis was innocent of the murder of his wife. There was a turn in the affairs that had not been expected. Cornwall started out of his chair, shivering, and his thin hands gestured frighteningly as he said, Pay him quick! Mr. Parsons handed me a check, a cashier's check for $130,000, and held out the receipt. The check was made out, as I had insisted, to J.C. Collins. Parsons thought it was my alias, or one of them. I scrawled a signature of some kind onto the paper, but my eyes were on the detectives. No sooner had I dropped the pen than they, awaiting their cues, stepped forward. The box, sir, demanded Parsons. Look up the word box in that dictionary, I taunted them. It's there. In a sort of stupid bewilderment, all eyes turned toward the large book. I might have known it, Cornwall squeaked. All is lost. All is not lost, cried the Parsons person Napoleonically. That scoundrel, He leveled an accusing finger at me.
"Shall pay for this. Officers, do your duty."
"Yes, officers, do," I said, for I'd seen what was coming as far off as one sees a headlight. "Put up your hands." They stepped back, their hands going upward, for there was a gun in each one of mine. I moved to the door, carefully laid one gun at my feet, opened the door, and without looking around, thrust out the check. "Everything's gonna be fine," I said without looking around. "You've just got time to get to the bank, if you hurry. I don't think they'll want to stop payment on it, but you can never tell." Dr. Collins had not paused to hear all I said. He was gone. I closed the door, picked up the other gun, swiftly searched the detectives, and stood them up where I could watch them with the least effort. "Cornwall," I said, "you probably thought you could get the dead woman to have God forgive you if you stole her daughter. Took the girl away from a father whom you knew to be innocent of all the crimes that threw him repeatedly into the penitentiary. That is all you know about women, living or dead. Personally, I have an idea that her spirit kept nagging at the conscience of Governor Walsh until he was roused to dare to do what he knew was right. No, I'm not religious, but I believe in the devil. How can one help it when such things as you, with the protection and aid of fellows like Parson here and these fat dicks, cumber the earth? Your box is in that dictionary. If you want it, look it up. I promised it, and I usually keep my promises, even to rich crooks." Parsons, puffing and angry, began oratorically to warn me of what was due to happen to me, and to explain how I could not escape. He was interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," I said. The door opened, and Steve Ellis and Governor Walsh, amazement scrawled across their faces, came in slowly. "There is one more to come," I reminded the boy who had showed them in.
"Yes, sir."
"Then notify Mr. Richmond. You remember?"
"Yes, sir."
I closed the door and turned around to look with complacence upon my little private drama, which was progressing quite well for an impromptu rehearsal. The two detectives against the wall had their hands up. That there might not be any mistake as to their identity, when I searched, I had taken the precaution of causing them to move their large badges into a more conspicuous position, and remarked, "What a fine advertisement this will be for your agency when it gets into the papers. Everything related to Cornwall and myself, you know, gets into the papers." There they stood, nearly bursting with shame. Joseph shivered in the deep plush chair, and Mr. Parsons rocked back and forth, glaring passionately from toe to heel. He was doing his best to look impressive, though he was a little handicapped by the circumstances. Governor Walsh was a solid man with something of the typical politician on his face, and something more, too. Some indication of the man that he might have been had he not for so many years placed career before conscience. I doubted not at all that he had made many compromises, yet to his credit it must be said that, though he had not been afraid to attack the Cornwalls openly, he had never tried to make friends with them secretly. "What is the meaning of this, sir?" demanded the governor with dignity. "It's a little reception committee, sir. By the way, Governor, I have been having a little dispute with these gentlemen over the word box. I believe you are interested in the subject, too. Mr. Daniel Cornwall was once sardonic enough to send you a photograph and a key. Ellis, would you mind looking up box in the dictionary?" Ellis stared at me as if sure that I was crazy. So did the governor and everyone else. I may have fancied it, but it seemed to me the detectives stretched their arms a little higher, as if realizing that I was crazy and might shoot, though I had put my guns away and tossed theirs across the room into a closet. I insisted, though with a certain lightness of tone, that Ellis open the dictionary. He hesitated, then went forward and laid his hands on the book. The room was silent. All were hushed. So the sudden knock on the door was like thunder. I spoke. The door opened, and I called to Ellis. "That dictionary, man! Open it!" Steve Ellis turned the book and exposed the box. At the same moment, my intelligent bellboy, with a hearty grin and an impudent, "In you go, old top," shoved the reluctant man through the doorway. The boy pulled the door shut and was gone. "Mr. Daniel Cornwall, gentlemen," I said, bowing toward the frightened figure, still in his clerical sideburns and black clothes. He carried a satchel in his hand. That satchel contained an enormous amount of cash, but as a matter of fact, Daniel Cornwall did not intend it for me. He had, in thinking over the interview of the previous night, decided to get together what money he could and permanently disappear, or perhaps some time later try to get his hands on his fortune. Anyway, he had that afternoon purchased a ticket when a little noiseless Chinaman thrust a card into his hand. The card, addressed to Cornwall, advised him that he would be arrested if he took another step in any direction except towards Suite C of the Treybourne Hotel. So it was that surprise after surprise had broken in that room. Daniel Cornwall shuffled furtively and turned toward the door, but realized that he could not make a break. Joseph raised himself out of his chair, then fell back, whispering huskily, "Daniel!" Mr. Parsons looked about, blinking and trying not to appear as if he were dreaming, but it wouldn't have taken much to convince him that he was. Fat, well-fed lawyers do not believe that such things as were happening then do happen outside of nightmares. Steve Ellis crouched slightly and hate leaped to his face. Governor Walsh stared incredulously, for Daniel Cornwall would not have seemed so out of place, so unreal, in his winding sheet as in this clerical dress. I had no time to waste. Dick Richmond would soon be coming into the room. "Mr. Cornwall," I said agreeably, "I have reason to believe that you haven't looked into this box for some time. Will you open it?" He stared at me dully for a moment, then anger came to his eyes. He realized how completely he had been trapped. I had told him that he could not imagine a more effective trap than the one which had caught him the night before, and it was his own lookout if he couldn't. "Oh, perhaps you never found the key I flung from the window. Governor Walsh, was it not for some such emergency as this that you were presented with a key? Will you be good enough to use it?" The governor looked at me hard, and his brain worked quickly. He jammed his hand into his pocket and pulled a key ring out, fingered the keys for a moment, and, selecting one, reached toward the box with a determined air. Joseph Cornwall actually sprang from his chair with two trembling, feeble hands outthrust. "It's mine, Everhard! Mr. Parsons! Please, officers, I paid for this box!" "Yes," I affirmed, "and for its contents. You see, Mr. Parsons, that here, in the presence of witnesses, gentlemen," I spoke to the detectives, who had taken their hands down but still held their places by the wall, "I call you to bear witness that Mr. Cornwall affirms the transaction. So, Mr. Parsons, you must change your mind about charging me with blackmail." The key did not work easily. The lock was a difficult one. As the governor, a little excitedly, turned and wrenched, it was only a matter of seconds, all drew nearer, craning their necks. The lid was lifted. Daniel made a movement as if to snatch at the contents, but his hands stopped as though he had suddenly come upon a snake. The governor, too, drew back amazed and looked at me. Yes, I said. "It is empty. But you see, when I got my hands on it 5 years ago, borrowed it one night from Mr. Cornwall here," Daniel, suddenly enlightened as to who had robbed him of the box 5 years before, cursed under his breath, "I took the liberty of destroying certain criminal evidence against a gentleman it is needless to mention. How did I know what had been put into that box since, or how valuable was its contents? Mr. Cornwall there," I indicated Joseph, "offered me a very handsome price, and his brother has also pledged himself to give me—" I cast significant glances at the satchel. "Unfortunately, I never got any of the money he had there. That was one place where my scheme fell down, but I was somewhat compensated by the expressions on the faces of the men about me. For 5 years, the man who was the governor of Utah had lived in fear and trembling of an empty box. At any moment of that time, had he, as he eventually did do, let his conscience get the better of his judgment, he could have smashed the Cornwalls and come off unscratched. For 5 years, the two cunning brothers had nursed an empty box as their talisman. So sure had Daniel been that none could open it without a key that he had not taken the trouble of having another key made to investigate its contents. He had seen me close the box with the papers in it. I explained to the governor, in as few words as I could, how I had stolen the box, to whom I had given it, and why, 5 years before. When I'd finished, he was silent, staring at me. Then he said that he had heard of me, but he had doubted a great deal of what he had heard. He believed now that he had been wrong to doubt. I felt sorry for Steve Ellis at that moment, for he had listened, and, listening, he understood a great deal that possibly he would not have believed had he heard it at any other time, under any other conditions. His face was an apology, his lips trembled. He said nothing. The atmosphere of the room was so tense that no one had noticed that the door stood open, nor who stood there, listening, waiting. I had kept a watchful lookout from the corner of my eye on Daniel Cornwall, though he stood perhaps some 10 feet from me. But at that he came near to fooling me because he had his gun in the side trousers pocket instead of in the hip pocket. He jerked it out and leveled it not at me but at the governor. Perhaps he intended the next shot for me, perhaps a third even for Ellis. The bursting roar of 2 guns, exploding almost at once, filled the room. detonating through the hall and set the hotel into a commotion. I had shot with nothing more than split seconds to work on, but the gun went from his hands just as he pulled the trigger and his hand was shattered. By one of those odd chances of luck, the bullet struck the little steel box and ricocheted into the dictionary. "If you had pointed it at your own head, I wouldn't have interrupted you," I said coldly, glancing past him to the doorway. To the detectives, I said, "There is some work for you. Arrest him for the murder of Mrs. Stephen Ellis."
"That's a lie!"
Joseph screamed, starting up. At that moment of crisis, brotherly love, family blood, and sharing of loot on dirty deals stood stronger in him than his pretended love for the dead woman. Joseph was an adroit scoundrel, 10 times more adroit, though less aggressive and daring than his brother. He had at one time practically convinced me that he had believed Steve Ellis had murdered her.
"That's a lie!" he cried. "Who accuses him? You?"
He glared contemptuously at me. I pointed toward the doorway. There, a little pale, rather thin but tense, determined, Cora stood, with Jack beside her, looking as if he was ready to fight the world.
"Yes, I do,"
she said, almost in a whisper, but a whisper that carried.
"Yes, I heard everything you and he,"
a finger went out toward Daniel Cornwall,
"said that night when you quarreled over what it was best to do since Quiller had told you who Mr. Everhard was. You thought it would be easy to keep Mr. Everhard fooled by not running away, by devising some story to tell him. You said he couldn't possibly know that Taggart had been sent by Daniel to rob my mother. I heard all you said. Both of you said."
End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. That's about all there is to tell. Everybody in the hotel seemed trying to get into the room. 2 house detectives did, and between them and the detectives at the private agency, they carried the trembling, shivering, protesting Daniel Cornwall off to jail. He might beat the murder charge, but there was no doubt that he had tried to kill the governor of Utah, and there are some things that not even a multimillionaire can do with impunity. I didn't get anything out of that satchel. The officers took charge of it, and so far as I know, it was eventually reverted to the Cornwall estate. I had a very hard time prying $10,000 loose from Dr. Collins. He could absorb a lot of reasons and argument without being in the least affected, but finally he was persuaded to write out a check for that amount to Steve Ellis, to whom it was given as a little nest egg to try new fortunes in the mining camps. As for Cora and Jack, anyone who can't guess what happened don't deserve to be told. Joseph Cornwall, through the very respectful and polite Mr. Parsons, appealed to me to refund the money. The old miser couldn't sleep well, more on account of that money, I do believe, than because of his brother, or the revelation that the governor of Utah made concerning Cornwall's bribery, thievery, forging of records, and general crookedness in stealing mining claims and getting them recorded. I listened quite respectfully to Mr. Parsons and referred him to Dr. Collins. It would take a crowbar and dynamite to get money intended for the Star of Hope Hospital out of his pockets. That Daniel Cornwall had tried to employ me as a gunman to dispose of Steve Ellis in New York was entirely in keeping with the way he had tried to settle his personal troubles in Utah. Not knowing how to get in touch with city crooks and find some of those people who will cut a throat for $1 or shoot a man for $5, he had thought to buy me for a few hundred, and probably would have paid the few hundred. More likely, he would have helped the police get evidence to prove that I did it. Many people have got into trouble with me because I am not a crook in just the ways that they think, if indeed I am a crook at all. It was highly probable that Daniel would have been acquitted of murder, for money is magic in criminal courts, and he was clever. Quiller, who showed more loyalty to Cornwall than the man deserved, told how they had with great difficulty, under pretense of being physicians, got hold of a suitable body from the morgue, dressed it in Daniel Cornwall's clothes, and thrown it in the water. I say it is highly probable that Cornwall would have been acquitted, but he killed himself by jumping from the train while being taken to Salt Lake for trial. Joseph, the wily, clever, plausible, legal member of the firm, had kept himself pretty well in the background of the Cornwall affairs. There was really no way of proving that he had meddled with even documents and records. The federal government took a hand, however, and snatched back some of the holdings that the Cornwalls had acquired. Joseph, though his miserly soul must have been dreadfully pained by the financial losses, never got into prison. He retired to some obscure place and was eventually forgotten. I have a beautiful little steel box wherein to keep valuable papers, if I ever acquire any. I have a key, too, and the key has a little gold case with a rather large diamond in it. The case is a miniature copy of the steel box, and has a little inscription showing that it was presented to me by the governor of Utah, though the governor spoke to me a little reproachfully for not letting him know 5 years earlier that I had done him such a service. I did not say so, but I had done him a greater service. I had let his own conscience finally rouse itself to defy the men whom he thought could ruin him, though in the wash-bowl of that cheap little Salt Lake rooming house I'd burned the evidence that they thought they had. End of Chapter 14, and end of Rich Crooks by Gordon Young. Read by Ben Tucker.